Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the Center for Urban Horticulture and to the 6th program in the Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Seeking Sustainability. Today's program is an outgrowth of considerable discussion at our college over the past several years as we have sought to define and articulate our strategic themes. The college is committed to provide world-class, internationally recognized knowledge and leadership for environmental and natural resource issues. Today, we look forward to an exciting and informative program that addresses many of these issues, and we have a panel of outstanding speakers who will address all aspects of this subject. We now take a little break from looking at our rural timbered lands to look at our urban environment. And we have Libby Soden from the city of Everett to help us with this transition. Libby has worked for the city of Everett Parks and Recreation Department for the last 14 years. For much of that time, she held the position of urban forester. Her current position is supervisor of the horticulture division at Everett Parks, where she oversees urban forestry, landscape, and greenhouse production. Libby is a certified arborist and earned an associate degree in landscape design and construction at South Seattle Community College. She worked for several years as an arborist, groundskeeper, and landscaper before continuing her education here at the University of Washington, where she earned both her Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in forest management at the College of Forest Resources. Libby's topic today is sustaining forested urban environments. Please welcome Libby Soden.
Thank you. It's really nice to be back. It's been a while since I've been here at the Center for Urban Horticulture. I'm going to talk a little bit. This will be quite a change of focus for everyone here. We're talking urban now. So I'm going to start with some definitions of what we mean by the urban forest and sustainability in the context that I work in. And then I'm going to talk about the types of stands that we manage, what the objectives we have in managing those stands, some of the challenges we meet, and some of the solutions we're coming up with to meet the challenges. So I'll start with the definition of an urban forest. Urban forest as an integrated collection of plants, people, wildlife, and structures that's dominated by trees. The urban forest consists of large and small patches of forest surrounded by the built environment and linked by vegetated corridors along streams, rivers, and transportation routes. By sustainability here, we mean we want the beauty, the greenness, the habitat, the character. We do not harvest anything. So what we're trying to sustain is something approaching a forest with some elements of maturity in place over time. Get this going. Start with a little bit of history to give you some idea of what we're dealing with in Everett. And I'll be following sort of the main street of Everett through the course of this talk. This is 1892 in Everett. This is our main street, Hewitt Avenue, and you can see from this slide that the whole area that I manage was once a big forest and everything was logged. We, we definitely have maybe 3 or 4 trees within the city limits that predate logging of our community. We're a blue-collar city. We're very industrial. We've been known as the city of smokestacks, and we're rather proud of that. We have a strong industrial base, and that's one of the things that urban foresters need to deal with and recognize. The infrastructure, the industry is very important to the community, just as important to community health as having vegetation and all the amenities that are provided by trees. This area here is Port Gardner Bay, again, early 1800s. Our technology shifts over time just as our forests change over time. We, at this point today, in this area that you're looking at here, our Navy home port sits with aircraft carriers and basic military machines. Most of our sawmills are gone. Most of the city of smokestacks is no more. We don't really pollute or stink anymore in Everett. But what we have now is Boeing, and that's our major employer. Here is the main street of Hewitt again. Somebody who's into cars can probably tell what vintage this is. I would say probably around 1960. And one of the things we're going to do is talk about this street as we go through. But notice at the moment, downtown, no trees anywhere. Here is Everett again back in the late 1800s, I would say, and the area that you're looking at is what is the northern part of Everett today. Surrounded on three sides by water. Everett's a great big moraine dumped by the glaciers. Very erosive geology, steep ravines that are treed. But back then, there were three little towns. Now those are just neighborhoods in what we are dealing with at the moment. And what has happened to Everett since then? Well, we've grown, and we've grown quite a bit. In 1980, our population was 54,000 people. In 2002, our population is 98,000 people. This is Everett today. What you were looking at before was just the northern tip of the peninsula. Our land base is pretty well defined. These are our borders. Somehow or another, we are expected to crowd another 33,000 people within this land base over the next 25 years. So how do we sustain a forest? Well, one of the most important things we do is land use planning. We have comprehensive plans for the city and comprehensive plans for the park that set aside areas to preserve vegetation. We have legislated environmentally sensitive areas by ordinance. We do not remove trees unless they create a danger to people. And we are charged with preserving and enhancing these pieces of vegetation that are left to us. Most people don't even recognize that those pieces of vegetation were once logged before they were born. So here's a overhead aerial photo of the north tip of town, and it shows sort of the types of stands that we deal with in urban forestry. In the center you see a big golf course, a park area. Those are the biggest areas of land that we have. Look around the edges, along the edge of the road. That's a steep, erosive slope along the river and the sound, and that vegetative greenbelt there is real important to us and another area that we manage and essentially can't touch except for hazard abatement. And then down in the bottom you see the other type of thing that we deal with in the urban area, which is neighborhoods, streetscape, built environment, and trees everywhere. So I'll start talking about stands, open space, greenbelt, and park areas. We have dozens and dozens of steep ravines with little creeks running through them in Everett. Like I said, our soil was glacial till and glacial deposits, very steeply eroded areas, and we are charged with keeping these areas vegetated, green, and providing that green character that Everett cherishes. Here's another shot. This is along the Snohomish River. Basically, our management objectives in taking care of our forested area were to preserve vegetation for wildlife, particularly salmon because of the Endangered Species Act. We are to keep the trees and plants growing. We're not to touch anything for harvest. And we're also at the same time to encourage and allow public access to these areas. So we manage for wildlife. We have all kinds of wildlife in Everett, particularly because we have those wonderful corridors along the rivers and along the transportation, along the highways and along the railroad tracks. We have lots of small mammals and birds, but we have all the wonderful things. We actually have whales in the bay. We don't really manage for those, but they're fun to watch. We have lots of deer. Everett is crawling with deer. About once a year, we have a cougar that comes into town that we have to capture and remove from town or kill. We have, every couple years, we have bears wandering around that are raiding the garbage cans. So we've just got tons of wildlife. But wildlife also presents its challenges, even though we don't specifically manage for anything, but shade, cover, et cetera, for salmon habitat, we're also kind of by de facto managing for the rest of this wildlife. So we have some other problem wildlife too. You can see that in urban environments, wildlife isn't all it's cracked up to be for some things. These cute little fuzzy guys, they're just so cute. And they do what beavers do, they chop down trees. And so what happens then? Those trees that those beavers chop down fall on our structures. This is the whole trouble with urban forestry, is the forest is more for people than it is for everybody else. We also have lots of problems in our, I guess I'd call these mature second growth stands of Douglas fir and hemlock. The typical diseases that foresters deal with out in the woods, root disease. When we have root disease in our stands of second growth, what they fall on is houses. This stand here, some of these trees, the sheds were built actually touching the trees. And when the trees started to blow down in the wind, this is a mobile home court. You've all seen pictures of what happens when trees blow down on mobile homes. So we ended up doing an abatement. This is the only logging we've ever done, basically removing trees that were threatening to fall on this mobile home court. So my only clear cut was a swath 120 feet wide, clearing the zone of areas that trees could fall on these mobile homes. Wind. Big forest trees in town are not a great idea, and Douglas firs are particularly brittle. I know from much experience, when the wind hits about 25 miles an hour, the branches start to break. We had a storm, back in the early 90s, where the winds were sustained at 80 miles an hour, and the branches broke everywhere. The whole town, it was unbelievable. The whole town was covered with Douglas fir branches. So the mayor set aside an area in the park and had a free weekend where the community could haul by themselves the branches from their yards. They hauled them in and they stacked them here in windrows, and we rented a tub grinder and ground up all the debris so we could resurface our trails. But living next door to a Douglas fir with it hanging over your house is definitely something I wouldn't recommend planting next to the built environment. Some people are willing to risk it. And that brings us to development. As we're trying to preserve and retain and sustain our forests, as we make these plans, we write things on our charts like preserve wetland and natural vegetation. That's all well and good, and we do need to do that, but there isn't much consideration of what that actually means. It's just kind of preserve. So we follow the rules. We cut into second growth Douglas fir stands like this, cut a swath through, and here you have a stand of trees that's grown up as one unit. They lean on each other, they act as a unit. So what happens when you come in and put a road through or build some houses next to them? Well, you probably all know what happens. They start to fall down. Unfortunately, they start to fall down on everything that's next door. So if we're mandated to preserve a stand and we have a situation like this with the property line and we're trying to preserve trees, what we do is we cut right up to the property line, set the grade where we want to, cut the roots, put up a construction fence, and that tree next door to the building then falls down on something. Or if it doesn't fall down yet, then we build around it. And we're told we have to save these trees, so the contractors build our apartment buildings, and here they are. There's no way. These trees are dead now. They had not fallen, but they'll have to be a very expensive treatment. They'll have to be pieced down to avoid damage to the buildings. There's just no way they will live, and there's no way they can miss once they start to go. And when they fall down, this is what happens. Best case scenario, this is what happens. You get some property damage. So far, and I shouldn't even say anything, so far we haven't had personal injury since I've been working in this field. It's pure, absolute luck. Another thing we do in our forested areas, we also have to provide public access, and we have a lot of people that use our parks and woods, and one of the things that's happened out there is we have acres and acres where there's absolutely no understory at all, just compacted soil and green algae on the top of it in amongst the trees. So what we've been doing is trying to focus transportation people walking on paths. Put some trail liners in, try to encourage people to, yes, enjoy the woods, but stay in one area instead of walking all over the place. You can see a little bit of bare earth in this. We've put a barrier up to stop the kids from riding their mountain bikes off the cliff and onto one of our main streets. And it works somewhat. They throw their bikes over the fence and go down anyway, but it's kind of stopped about 85% of it. But look how bare the forest floor is there. That's actually not a real bare example, but it's some of the effects of foot traffic that we have in our forest. So the way we go about trying to preserve our forest is in planting. We plant understory trees. We try to plant trees that will grow up and grow to maturity in the conditions that they have. You have to be sure you do shade-tolerant trees in a situation like this and try to keep that forest going. We have root rot everywhere. We know our big trees are failing. We need to plant underneath so that something will be there to grow up so that we can sustain this wooded area that the community loves. People absolutely love trees, especially these great big heritage trees. This is a copper beech. It was, for at least for a while, one of the largest ones in the state, one of our state champs. And it's planted in the cemetery where it has lots and lots of room to grow. People, you can't believe the emotion that people feel for their large trees. It's one thing you learn in urban forestry is there is no neutral about trees. People either absolutely love them and will tie themselves to the tree. You can't touch these trees. And as I said, we have a mandate. We do not harvest trees. The only trees we cut down are dangerous. Here we have another set of heritage trees, which leads me into the other kinds of tree stands that I manage, and that's street trees. These are some great big elms planted between the curb and the sidewalk in a neighborhood. They're beautiful. We're preserving them. We wouldn't dare touch them. I'd lose my job if I touched those trees. But they are causing a little bit of damage. And this is back again from the history. This is Hewitt Avenue again. After the early 60s, which is when the last photo was planted, the community mandated that we change our urban character. We soften the building lines. We add a little class and value, a little habitat, some beauty to our downtown area. So these trees were planted right in the center of downtown in a planting strip it's about 7 feet wide. This, if you want controversy, talk about managing street trees. They're beautiful. We love them. We love what they do for our community. This, to me, if I had an ideal street tree stand, this would be it. Here you have a mix. You have the beautiful cherries in full bloom with room to actually grow. You have some big conifers in the background. On the other side of the street, you have some tall elm trees. Down the street, you can see you've got a different variety. So you have your diversity. You have different sizes of trees at maturity, trees that are going to live longer, trees that are going to die sooner. So when they die, you do have an actual chance to come in and do some rotation and plant some different trees. To me, this is ideal. Of course, the thing you don't see in here is a bunch of houses. This is in our parks, so we have a little room to work. Trees have a very hard time in the city. Street trees just really have it tough. They can't move. Whatever happens, there they are. So if they're planted on top of underground utilities, their roots go down and tangle up. They get vandalized. They're planted in spaces that are too narrow. They're planted under power lines. Or they're planted there doing just fine, and we come along and decide we want a power line, or we want a sewer line, or we want to narrow the curb and put in a new street. So they're just there. I read a fact. They deal with a lot of pollution, and there's vandalism, and there's impacts from vehicles. In New York City, in a single day, 11,000 gallons of dog urine are deposited on the trees. That's not a pretty thought. So here's a tree just standing there, planted probably perfectly well. Our infrastructure is just as dynamic as our forests are. We're putting in new gas lines here, and I think they're actually tunneling under the trees in this case. I don't know if this tree made it through the process or not, but remember, our technology is changing. One of the big things that's happening to us right now with our street trees, many of which were planted 25 years ago directly under the power lines nobody used to look up. Well, now the power lines are getting lower and lower because we're increasing our need for computer hookups, telephones. So if you look at power poles around the region, you'll notice that they're getting whole new sets of lines down below those. And so all those trees that were sort of okay under there now are cut in half, and it's just really difficult to deal with. People plant trees in silly places too. We are required to have 14 feet of clearance above the edge of the curb. We don't have it here. This fellow bought a new camper, drove up, parked his car, went in the house, came back out the next day, pulled forward, forgot the camper was there, and this is the kind of thing that happens. Planting trees in bad places, under wires, blocking signs. This little guy will turn up into this one someday. Planting trees in narrow areas, roots are in the way. And in really poor areas, another law that comes into effect is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is something all of us urban people deal with a lot. It's against the law to have more than a half-inch difference between paved sections because people can trip and fall or not navigate their wheelchairs. We are definitely not in compliance in a lot of our areas. This tree was a little bit big for the space. And here's another one, a cherished tree, giant sequoia planted next to a house, tearing up the sidewalk, and it'll grow up to be that unless the tree or the house goes. Hazard trees, the only trees we get to take down are hazardous. Their branches, they do decline and die, and when they do, you don't want your kid in the swimming pool underneath. Storm events, etc. Trees fall down on houses, trees fall down on cars. Planting is the key. How we plant our trees, at least for sustaining street tree environments, is very important. Give them room above ground, give them room below ground. Make sure that they have room to grow and that there aren't utilities underneath. Actually, legally, you have to call dial-a-dig. You have to check utilities before you dig a hole. Hardly anybody does that, but that's sort of our job to figure that out. So here's our beautiful street. This last summer, Hewitt Avenue again, flowers, trees, looking gorgeous, can hardly see the buildings. Unfortunately, those trees are planted on top of the sewer main, causing just about $500,000 a year in damage to the sewers. So despite great public outcry, the city finally made the economic decision that the trees had to come out. This is last week. So how do you sustain a street tree planting? In this case, what we're trying to do is dig larger areas for the tree roots, put in some irrigation. This is halfway excavated, put in some root barrier, then some soil, and then plant the trees back with the way for them to thrive. Community is really important. Getting your kids out to plant trees is one of the best things you can do for community support. Kids love to help. Maintenance is where we spend our money. And I guess one of my messages today is that urban trees take intensive management. You don't get any dollars at the end. All you do is get to be a tree executioner when they come down. You spend all your money planting and taking care of them. And it's expensive. We have dry summers. You need to water trees in the summer, so if you plant trees and expect them to live through the establishment period, which is about 3 years, you want to keep them watered. Take proper care of them, prune them. Involve your schools. That's so important. In community buy-in, your community wants the forest. Your kids are learning those ecological concepts that we didn't learn until college. They're learning all about how good trees are for the environment and teaching their parents. When kids or parents come out to plant a tree or do something, then you have buy-in to your community, and we're looking for funds. So another source of funding is always good, trying to find grants and dollars to plant trees and care for trees. So we're trying to have these beautiful stands of trees. They take a lot of management, intensive care. All the money is spent during the life of the tree. Those dollars come from our general fund dollars. We don't have any revenue coming in. We're competing with the police and fire departments to take care of trees. So basically planning, setting aside areas, involving your community and your schools, and getting the public out there to support you is how you maintain these forests. Thank you. the hook.
Thank you very much, Libby. Your talk really highlighted some of the vast differences between our rural and our urban forest sustainability issues. Issues of scale were very evident. Differences in scale between the urban and rural were very evident during your presentation. Now we're going back to the forest again. Our next speaker is Court Stanley. Court is the Vice President and Chief Forester for the Port Blakely Tree Farms Limited Partnership. Court is a graduate of the University of Washington College of Forest Resources, receiving his degree in forest engineering. And he has been with Port Blakely for over 17 years. Port Blakely Tree Farm manages land and timber in western Washington and in Oregon. Its history can be traced back to 1864. The company strives to manage its lands on a conservative, long-term basis to ensure its continued growth, and has been certified according to the Sustainable Forestry Initiative standard of the American Forest and Paper Association. Court also serves on the executive committee of the Washington State Society of American Foresters as education co-chair. The title of his presentation today is The Forest Industry Perspective on Sustainability. Please welcome Court Stanley.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm honored to be here today, speaking from the industry's perspective, but I need to narrow my talk a little bit and speak more on Port Blakely's perspective of sustainability. In order to do that, I need to give you a little bit of background on Port Blakely. As Bruce mentioned, the company was founded in 1864 by Captain Renton, who built a sawmill on Bainbridge Island, specifically Port Blakely. That's probably how they got their name. Captain Renton started purchasing land to go along with the sawmill and eventually sold it in 1902 to the Eddy family. The Eddys have maintained the company ever since. It's still family owned. The sawmill burnt in 1920, and so the company's managed forest lands ever since. From our perspective, there's 4 elements to sustainability: economic, environmental, social, and industrial. I'd like to go through each of these 4 aspects one by one and explain how it fits in the role of private forest land. And to start it off, I put in an excerpt of our management objective within our forest management plan. And right off the bat, it says that we need to maximize financial returns to the current and future generations of the family. The second portion of the management plan that I didn't include, it says that we need to do this while we enhance and maintain the ecological values that occur on our private forest lands. So with that, I'd like to touch on the first element of sustainability from our viewpoint, the economic. We're fortunate to be able to live in a society and in a state, and for me to work for a company that is wealthy. That enables us to concentrate on a concept like sustainability. For us to remain sustainable, our business has to be sustainable. These 5 bullet points are some of the elements that keep our company sustainable economically. The first, and we've heard quite a bit about it today, is sustainable timber flow or sustained yield. Essentially, we don't cut any more trees than we can grow. Port Blakely is a little bit more rigid on sustained yield than most companies in that we do a non-declining even flow. That means simply that we have a set harvest rate measured in terms of board feet that we harvest every year. We don't go above it. We try to stay right on target. That gives the owners of the company long-term certainty that we won't run out of trees. Within the constraints that that sustained yield gives us, we have to maximize the return to the shareholders on a sustainable basis. Given that constraint, we need to market wisely and efficiently to keep our shareholders happy. Because without the family's involvement in our company, we would not be sustainable. Having said that, we need to have sustainable markets. Our ownership is spread out from Coos Bay to Everett. We don't have enough timber in one spot to completely sustain a mill or to have a mill of our own. So we need to depend with others, with a critical mass of other landowners such as ourselves, to keep our markets sustainable. Forestry is a strange business to be in. The trees we're going to plant this January, we won't see an economic return on for 70 years. In order for us and for the shareholders to stay in this business, we need to be fairly sure that the trees we plant today will be able to harvest in 70 years. And that means having sustainable regulations and stable regulations. Washington State is one of the most regulated areas in the world to practice private land forestry. We need to keep the regulations stable that we can do business in Washington State. And lastly, in order to stay a sustainable business, we decided we had to diversify, mainly because of markets and regulatory creep. The company decided that we would go to New Zealand and purchase forest lands. And it's interesting that in New Zealand, we need a permit to plant a tree, but not to harvest. And in Washington State, we can plant all the trees we want, but boy, we have to go through a lot of permits to harvest. The second element I'd like to talk about is environmental sustainability. As being owners of forest land, we have the responsibility to be good stewards of our forest land. Stewardship is completely different now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. We have to evolve our stewardship in line with social values and in line with what knowledge we can gain on natural resources. We've made a commitment that the streams that flow out of our property are going to be cool and clean, and that the species that live in and around those riparian areas on our property are going to be protected. We also want to enhance wildlife values that occur on our lands, keep habitats spread across a mosaic of our lands, and we also need to protect those rare ecosystems that occur on our ownership. Our main asset, though, is soil. Trees are our products, but the factory is soil. Without taking care of the soil, there's no way we could be sustainable. That means responsible harvesting, low ground compaction equipment, and leaving organic debris and slash on the forest floor. The third element I'd like to talk about is social sustainability, and it's been touched on a bit today, but we try to play our part in sustaining the communities that we operate in and around. That means from hiring local tree planters, thinners, loggers, to purchasing our pickups and our gas from local communities. We need to support the schools that are in and around our communities. We provide educational opportunities for the kids to take them out in the woods and see what kind of benefits private forest land plays. We also have our lands open, mostly for walk-in, to the public for berry picking, hunting, and just enjoying second growth forests. And finally, we have a responsibility to manage for cultural resources with local tribes. We like to do it on a local level with individual landowners, with individual tribes, developing trust so that we can find these resources that are important to the tribes and protect them. Finally, we need to sustain the private forest land industry within Washington State. In order to do that, We've been committed to being heavily involved in the policy decisions that affect private forest land management, both in the federal level and the state level. We try with all our foresters to have continuing education that we can keep up on the new models, growth rates, and research that's happening in the industry and promote it. And further, the education of future foresters. It's a perfect forum to talk about it, the UW, but we need to make sure the best and the brightest keep an interest in this business and keep our private forest land industry going. Finally, we need to keep up in the technology that's making our job easier, that we can compete on a global scale in order to keep our forest products from Washington State important in a global market. Finally, we've been hearing all day a broad range of management techniques for different forest landowners. To put it in context, we've heard from the parks, which is on the left-hand side of the spectrum, to Port Blakely Tree Farms, which is not quite on the far right. I would reserve that for publicly traded companies. We're kind of in the mix, coming close to perhaps the DNR state ownership. No forest landowner or entity in the state can be all things to all people, and each of us have to provide our part in the ownership of forest land. Finally, we can pat ourselves on the back and say we do a good job and we do all this, but to really be sure we are practicing sustainable forestry, we need two things. First, we need public education. Both the public educating us and us educating the public on what role private forest lands have in the state of Washington. Secondly, we need third-party verification that what we're doing is responsible. There are two systems that are currently popular in the Northwest: Sustainable Forestry Initiative and Forest Stewardship Council. I won't spend too much time going into them. That'll be another half hour to an hour. But we have gone through certification with SFI through PricewaterhouseCoopers. We've gone through a gap analysis of FSC, and we're waiting for the West Coast standards to be finalized before we make a decision whether we go that route as well. So finally, to put it into context, I'm proud to work for a company that's been around 140 years. And it's fun to be planning for the next 70 to 100 years for the next generation of foresters that are going to come into play. But in order to make sure that we are around 100 years from now, we have to maintain our business stability and sustainability, encompassing the four elements that I've talked about today. And if we do that, we will be around for 100 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Court. That was a real nice presentation, and it summarized a lot of what we've heard this morning. We really appreciate your coming to share your thoughts with us today. Our next speaker is Claire Ryan. Claire is an assistant professor of natural resources policy in the College of Forest Resources and an adjunct assistant professor with the Daniel J. Evans School of Public Affairs and the School of Marine Affairs. She received her Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences in 1983 from Western Washington University, and then went on to receive a Master of Science in 1990 and a PhD in 1996 from the University of Michigan in Natural Resource Policy and Administration. Her research interests include natural resource policy formulation and implementation, environmental conflict management, collaborative processes, water resource policy and management, and urban ecology. At the present time, Dr. Ryan is researching participant roles in collaborative decision-making processes, adaptive management in the United States and Canada, non-point source pollution control, assessing methods and behaviors, and collaborative watershed planning in Washington and Oregon. In addition to doing all of that, she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in natural resources policy, conflict resolution and urban ecology at the University of Washington. She is also serving for 1 year as co-director of our new Center on Water and Watershed Studies between the College of Forest Resources and the Civil Engineering Department in the College of Engineering. Today, Claire is going to talk to us on the topic Scientific Research, Perspective, and Adaptive Management Practices. Please welcome Claire Ryan.
Part of what you may have noticed is that we've talked a lot today about what is sustainability, and this project I'm going to talk about today talks about some of the institutions that are trying to do sustainable forestry. So I'm going to talk about at least a couple of efforts that address how we might achieve sustainability in terms of institutions that can help us get there. And this study that I conducted with some colleagues looks at adaptive management areas and model forests in the United States and British Columbia. So it's looking at two efforts that are more government or public driven than some of the private efforts that you may have heard of. So I want to talk a little bit about some of our research questions and our approach, a little bit on our findings about how adaptive management is being implemented in practice, some of the barriers, some of the opportunities, and some of the additional thoughts we've had about how do you foster some of these sustainable institutions to achieve sustainable forestry. And I like this statement from Kai Lee because I think it's still quite relevant today. And we've been doing a lot of work about what sustainability is, and a lot of discussion about measures, criterion indicators. But one of the key driving questions behind our study was the how. How do we do this? How do we achieve sustainable practices? So we were not concerned with what sustainability is, but more concerned with the how. How do we get there? And again, as I mentioned, we looked at two examples in forestry specifically. So we thought, well, maybe an effort at getting at the sustainable question is these efforts at doing adaptive management. There was a hope that the adaptive management concept might be a way to achieve some of the sustainable practices. And adaptive management the idea has been around for more than 30 years. What we haven't seen are a lot of examples of successful implementation of adaptive management, whether it be in fisheries and other resource areas. And there's kind of a sense that adaptive management might be more of a good idea than a proven kind of practical approach. But we thought since there's these 10 adaptive management areas in the United States and some model forests up in Canada, this might be a way to look at how is it implemented, and do these adaptive approaches, are they more conducive to sustainable kinds of activities? So we looked at the evolution of those institutions, and I'll report a little bit on the implementation to date. Many of these cases that we looked at are in very different phases of implementation. So our approach consisted of a pretty large literature review, document review, and after we conducted those, we used two major prongs in terms of getting data. One was interviews with managers, scientists, and citizens who were involved in all of the adaptive management areas and the model forests. These were semi-structured interviews. We did about 50 of them. And a lot of these questions, the same questions to all of the respondents, involved questions about how they're implementing adaptive management, what kinds of things were facilitating that, what kinds of barriers were they encountering as they tried to conduct adaptive management. Following on with those interviews, we developed a mail questionnaire, and this was only administered to the adaptive management areas. It was not administered to the model forests. But this was administered also to citizens and agencies, managers, scientists that were involved in adaptive management areas. We got back 565 usable surveys, so a response rate of 74%. And most of you are probably familiar with the concept of adaptive management. I thought about putting that little figure up with the arrows and the circle, but I knew I was going to be limited on time. If you're not familiar with it, it's a term that describes an approach to natural resource management that consciously uses experiments in its policy and in its management actions So it enables people, theoretically, to learn about the systems as they are managing them. There's a very important piece of adaptive management is learning, and is that feedback loop of once you've implemented an action, let's monitor it and learn from it, and then you might modify your management practices. So in the United States, adaptive management in forestry, at least as construed currently, evolved through a number of different actions, different events, and many of those related to the listing of endangered species. So there's a number of, the spotted owl was the first, and then continuing with a number of salmonid species. A lot of conflict in the late 80s, early 90s, and gridlock and litigation over management of public forests. So again, we're looking at public land management. The Clinton administration convened the Forest Summit, or the Forest Conference, in 1993. They designated the Forest Ecosystem Management Assessment Team to come up with some options for a way out of this gridlock, so a way to do regional forest management, taking into account some of these endangered species concerns and other concerns over forestry. The record of decision, little acronym there, resulted in this Northwest Forest Plan. In that plan is an option that designates the adaptive management areas. So part of the final decision of the Forest Service and this forest plan was the designation of 10 adaptive management areas: Washington, Oregon, and California. And the management and decision making in those adaptive management areas is the responsibility of either the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. They are large collaborative efforts, but the ultimate decision-making authority is with those land management agencies. And this is just a quick picture of where those areas are. There's 10 of them. They each have very different goals, very different objectives, very different environments, different problems. And a whole nother presentation could be on the progress and how each of those adaptive management areas has conducted a lot of their planning. But basically the purpose of these adaptive management areas was to develop and test alternative forest management practices. And each of those adaptive management areas had the ability to plan and decide what those would be. The hope was that it would lead to some sustainable forest practices. And the situation isn't all that different in Canada. And again, I've said British Columbia, but across Canada, I looked only at British Columbia. There are very different laws, very different policies, very different institutions, very different cultures, big significant differences between Canada and the United States. But again, we were seeing the same kind of conflict, gridlock, concern, protests over forest practices in Canada as we saw in the United States. And many of these protests emerged slightly later. Many of you may have read about the protests in Clayoquot Sound where more than 800 people were arrested. That's very unusual in Canada to have that kind of direct action, mobilization of interest groups, and that was a big deal in Canada. And in response, the Canadian national government came up with what was called the Green Plan in 1991. And there was a pledge there to try, again, get out of the gridlock, but try to have sustainable forest management. And so what they came up with was a different way of designating some of these adaptive management areas or model forests, but they had a process where a proposal and review process where if you wanted to be a model forest, you would propose, and those were reviewed and then selected. So they were not designated like they were in the United States. In Canada, there was 90 letters of intent submitted. I think they got 50 proposals, and then 12 model forests were selected throughout Canada. And the management and decision making is slightly different. There is a management board, but somewhat similar to the United States. I won't go into great detail on the decision making. They were formed quite differently though, and that's something to keep in mind. So the two model forests I looked at in Canada, the Long Beach does not exist anymore as a model forest, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but two proposals were selected in British Columbia. The Mcgregor Model Forest and the Long Beach. And again, I'm not going to go into great detail. Each model forest has some different goals, different objectives. But generally, again, the idea was, can we demonstrate sustainable forestry? And can we use these model forests as a way of doing that? So that kind of gives you the background of the area that we were looking at, and I want to tell you a little bit about what we found in terms of how adaptive management is being implemented in practice, and whether we can say yet even does it mean that we're doing sustainable forestry. Again, these are fairly early on in the implementation, so it's not a complete and comprehensive evaluation. Despite the differences, there are some big similarities across the whole West, if you look at British Columbia all the way down to the adaptive management areas in Canada. What we found was very few on-the-ground experiments to date that people had documented. A lot of planning, a lot of collaborative processes, and in Canada they had done quite a bit more modeling and scenario building than in the United States. Also common to all of these areas was a claim and a sense of increased knowledge of the inventory or the area that they were working in. So kind of better understanding of the area and some technological advances in terms of either the modeling in Canada, especially some of the scenario building, and a lot of work on criterion development, which we've heard about today, is kind of what are the criteria that we should be looking at for sustainable forestry. A lot of people mentioned, everyone mentioned the impact of relationships between the stakeholders that were involved in these, or some of the social impacts. In most cases, these relationships took time to build, took time to get going. Trust had to be established in many cases. And in most cases, they said that they felt that the social relationships had improved. Long Beach Model Forest is a case that doesn't follow that, and we can talk about that maybe in the panel. But in most cases, there was an increase in participation, a sense that other partners, not just government or industry, understood what was going on and had a say in the participation and in the decision making. And many of these spent quite a bit of time, as I said, developing that trust. There was a lot of social issues, a lot of conflict to get over in many areas. And also, everyone has mentioned this, not so much in Canada, but in the United States, a resource shortage. In the United States, it's not really a shortage right now, it's a complete absence of resources in terms of funding or personnel. There are still personnel that are working on it, but no funding for the adaptive management areas. So there's very much an absence of monetary resources for implementation. And so what again, to kind of conclude here is this question of, we've spent a lot of time talking about what sustainability is. What we found in this study was we were surprised that it really is, how do we do this? How do we have institutions that can do this? Many of the respondents didn't mention criteria, indicators. That's almost a given. They felt they had that, or they could develop it collaboratively. What they were struggling with was, how do we do this? And what institution or what arrangement of institutions is the right arrangement to help this happen? And again, you can flip exactly some of those barriers and say, well, here's what we need if we're going to have an institution that can do this. And this study isn't meant to be kind of an obituary, so to speak, for adaptive management or sustainable forestry. It's just saying we need to spend as much time on the how as the what. An obvious thing is, well, what is it? What is sustainable forestry? What is adaptive management? If you can get some shared understanding of that and clarify the expectations, you may get yourself further down that road. And again, leadership, internal and external. So there needs to be leadership within those institutions, some kind of a vision, some kind of a source of support, energy, motivation. And that can come from inside the institution or outside. And in most cases in Canada that seemed successful, it did come from both. It didn't just come from one end of that spectrum. Change is always going to be resisted. I think the last speaker talked about change. It will be resisted, but it's going to happen. And we need champions. You need some kind of institutional arrangements or incentives to make change happen, to build this learning organization. The other issue is, again, these two maybe you don't have much control over, but you can work on these relationships, work on the trust. Without the trust, without those relationships, you can't really start that dialogue about, well, what values should we manage for and to what level and over what time frame. So you can talk about a lot of the criteria, but until you sit down, the how part, the hard part, is sitting down and figuring out how do we agree what the mix is, and that's where the relationships and trust come in. The whole issue of learning, fostering learning, documenting what you're doing, thinking about learning explicitly, and then linking that learning to specific actions. This part of that adaptive management equation doesn't seem to be happening. So it's an important element. It's not an end in itself, but it's something that if you're going to kind of complete that loop, and hopefully those adaptive practices are leading to more sustainable action, you've got to complete the loop, make the change, understand when you've learned something, and incorporate that into your policies and actions. So again, despite some of the problems, there are some success stories. There's a couple in Canada that are doing quite well, and it is early on. I do want to say it's early on in the implementation of this, but these are just a couple things that have come out of the study so far in terms of how do we do sustainable forestry. Many of them are institutional, and these are some of the things that seem to be necessary if it's going to be possible in the future. That's it. Thanks.
I wish to thank you for joining us today for this edition of the Denman Forestry Issues series on seeking sustainability. For more information on this and other forestry topics, please send us an email to cfruw@u.washington.edu. Thank you.